There are different levels of Teshuvah, and they operate in different ways and in different time frames. We'll learn that from the Zohar on this week's parasha. In Zohar parasha saying is before einer von dem Meiles von Bali Teshuvah tzadikim gemurim. The Zohar this week tells us one of the great advantages of a Bal Teshuvah over a tzaddik, even a perfect tzaddik, is that by tzadikim gemurim is the avodah baliyah b'seid v'adaga miyom l'yom. That the way that tzadikim serve the Eibishter is an incremental, step-by-step fashion where they're consistently growing, which of course is a tremendous thing, midarga ledarga, from level to a point of complete mastery. Like it says in our parasha, Avram Zaken, Ba Bayomim Gomer, that Avram Avinu, when he reached an age of advanced age physically and spiritually, he was considered Ba Bayomim. All of the days had contributed to that development and that spiritual growth. And the theme is echoed in the Haftarah this week, where we see Vahamelech David Zaken, Ba Bayomim Gomer, that David HaMelech also brought his whole life with him, all the stages along the way. And the tzaddik progresses and progresses and progresses until they reach a state of perfection, of absolute mastery. Balei Teshuvah don't work in that incremental way. Balei Teshuvah is b'shaita chada, whereas Balei Teshuvah, they could move in an hour, or b'yom chada, or in a day, or b'rega chada, or in a moment. Craving l'gabe kutchabricha, that brings them close to the Eibishter. So the Rebbe's father has a question on this. The timing that the Zohar puts in this explanation doesn't seem to really make sense. So the Rebbe's father asks, it would appear that the way that this is presented in the Zohar does not follow a logical sequence. What would have been logical would have been to start with the largest amount, yoima, a day, shaita, then an hour, then rega, a moment. Here it goes, hour, day, moment. That would have been logical, because you'd say, not only can you do tshuva in a day, you can do tshuva in an hour. Not only in an hour, you could even do tshuva in a moment. And also, also, if you could do tshuva in one moment, why do we have to give the options of doing tshuva in an hour and certainly in a day? So the Rebbe's father explains this based on something that the Alter Rebbe says in Likutei Torah. So he explains that there are three types of Teshuvah, and they reach three different levels. There's Teshuvah which only gets to the level of Malchus, Teshuvah which is beyond that reaches into the level of Zah, and Teshuvah that reaches the level of Bina. And Shaman references us to the Alter Rebbe's Maimer in Likutei Torah, which speaks about this in a lot of detail. As a Darga in Teshuvah, there he explains that the first level of Teshuvah is simply just avoidance of those things that are inappropriate. That allows a person to have access to the level of Malchus. Then there's a more developed kind of Teshuvah, which is not just simply escaping the things that are negative in this world, which is very much what Malchus is about engaging the reality of this world. But somebody who does Asay Tov generates positivity in the world by undertaking positive and good things to do. So that already speaks to the level of Zoh, which is about Gilui and revelation of godliness. Omegir b'Zoh therefore takes us to the level of Zoh. And says and then there's an even more advanced type of Teshuvah that the Alter Rebbe describes, which is Vosinyonis Bakis Sholem, that is to seek peace, which is achieved through Limud HaTorah. Omegir b'Bina, and because that is associated with Torah, which obviously is beyond the realities of this world and is associated with the Eibishter's intellect, so therefore takes us up to the level of Bina. Says the Rebbe Leivik, so when we're doing Teshuvah of Sumera, which only gets to the level of Malchus, we call that Teshuvah an hour, because Malchus is related to the concept of an hour. But Yoima is B'Zoh Nikra Yoim. When a person does the kind of Teshuvah of Asay Tov, which brings light into the world, that takes us to the level of Zoh, which is considered or called day. And Berega B'Bina, an instantaneous Teshuvah, that is a very high level of Teshuvah, which is at the level of Bina. So, it would seem, based on what the Rebbe's father has said, it would sound like the time frames offered by the Zohar, not so much about the actual time frame that Teshuvah takes, but rather they are references to three levels of Teshuvah. And those three levels are alluded to in these time frames. So we're not defining how long Teshuvah takes. And Shaita is Malchus, Yoma is Zoh, and Rega is Bina. On the far is recht was stehen in Zohar mit dem Seder. And that would explain obviously why the order is such as presented in the Zohar. But das if we say Madregas Mamata Lamaila, because then Shah is the lowest level, so that's put first, that's Malchus. Yoma is a high level in that because it takes us all the way to Zah, so that's put next. And Rega is the highest level because that's Teshuvah that takes us to Bina, so it's put last. That would seem to be the explanation. However, the Rebbe says it's not as simple as that because these time frames have to be relevant as well. It's not so clear. We know that whatever we learn in Torah has to make sense at the simplest level of learning it as well. So we have to accept that these three forms of Teshuvah, Sumera, Asay Tov, Bakei Shalom, Malchus, Zoh, Bina, was eine Megibbe Malchus bezobe Bina, is jeder von sich verbunden mit dem bestimmten Zman Kipshute. They must still somehow have a connection to these time frames. And so the Teshuvah from Sumerah is Magibba Malchus Tutzichuf B'Shaita Chada, which means the kind of Teshuvah which is Sumerah happens in an hour. The Hechre Darge in Teshuvah Vasei Tovas is Magibba Zah in the Zman from Yom Chada. The more advanced Teshuvah which takes us to Zah, which is the Teshuvah Vasei Tov, that takes more time and needs a full day. On the Hechre Darge by Kishalem Torah, and the highest level of Teshuvah, which is to seek peace through Torah, was Magibba Bina, takes us to the level of Bina, and yet is Arega Chada, is instantaneous, and we have to understand why that is. And in order to understand that, we're going to say we have to look at when something is short versus when something is long. Is that a sign that the shorter version is a higher or a lower level? And it's going to depend on perspective. So we have to understand. About Teshuvah is miyad always the fact that a person who does Teshuvah immediately connects to the Eibishter. The reason for that is because of the nature of Teshuvah. That's because Teshuvah is something which is beyond the normal sequential movement of any process. Here you've got a person who previously was in a very unhealthy space, and they leap over through Teshuvah into a much healthier, completely different reality. They go from a place where they are living antithetically to what the Eibishter wants to a place of complete commitment and connection to what the Eibishter wants. So what powers and drives Teshuvah is a dimension of the neshama which is not locked into that sequential process. So it doesn't need those same limitations of time. That's why instantaneously a person can connect. Now, if that's how Teshuvah works, that you leap literally from one reality to an opposite reality, then it doesn't make sense. Because how can it then be that a more advanced, higher level of Teshuvah, represented by Asay Tov, which obviously is achieved through a much deeper awakening of Teshuvah, why is that related to a period of time? It takes a whole day, apparently, to achieve that Teshuvah. Surely that doesn't make sense. Teshuvah is something which is beyond the constraints of time. So why is a more developed Teshuvah locked back into the constraints of time? And the truth is, we can extend this question to the spheres as well. We know that whatever is happening in our world is a reflection of, an extension of, an evolution of, and a product of the things that are happening in the higher realms. Especially when you consider that the whole purpose of all these higher realms is to eventually generate our world, because that's really the focus of the Eibishter's objective of creation. So how does it make sense? The high levels are, which is obviously more removed from the constraints of the physical world, which includes the constraints of time. That is a world that is represented by day, a long period of time. On the Nidrika Daga Malchus Shaita, whereas a lower level Malchus, which is more engaged with this world, and therefore apparently more locked into the constraints of time, is represented by a shorter period, Shaita. Doesn't make sense. A day is a longer period. If it's a longer period, it means it's more stuck in the convention of time, and it is less removed from time. Vishaita. So in order to understand that, we've got to look at this principle of longer versus shorter, which is actually the higher reality. And again, it's going to depend on perspective. So if we're talking about the intellectual process, when you have a very succinct or abridged intellectual process versus an elaborate intellectual process, which one, is hecher, which one is actually more advanced, there's actually room to argue both sides. There's an argument to say, and we keep things brief, it shows advancement, and there's an argument to say when you can be complex, it shows advancement. Because there is an advantage to brevity. As the Rambam uses when he's speaking about the Mishnah, that the greatness of the Mishnah is that it's extremely succinct, and yet it contains so much information, so many topics within very few words. Unlike the Gemara, where things are much more spelled out and elaborate, and that implies that Gemara is actually a lower spiritual level than Mishnah. We see the same kind of distinction between Rishonim, let's say like Rashi, who is so incredibly succinct and is able to, with his brilliance, pack so much information into so few words, compared to Achronim, who go into much, much more detail. To put it slightly differently, as far as statement, when you're looking at an intellectual concept at its root, is in Kitzer, and there it's absolutely brief. You've got the idea, you've got the whole idea in your head. But now you've got to translate the way that you understand something in your head and explain it to somebody else who doesn't see things the way that you see them. Well, then you have to be elaborate. For Mishnah and Gemara, or from Gemara for example, when you go to the Mishnah, which is obviously more of the source, and of course a pasuk where even one letter could be the source, to the Gemara where you've got to now spell it out because you're speaking to individuals who perhaps are at a lower level of understanding. So on the one hand, brevity is an indicator of something that's higher and more advanced. But on the other hand, the Chazal teach us that the way we should educate is the way that we impart information to our students should be brief and succinct. And there's a very logical reason for this. A student is not yet at the level that they can be bombarded with all the complexity and all the insights and the research that the teacher has possibly done. So therefore what you impart to the Talmud has to be as brief as possible, because that will be suitable to what he can actually absorb. Which illustrates that brevity is actually addressing the limitations of the student. So on the one hand, brevity means I can see the whole thing at once, and therefore I don't have to spell it all out. On the other hand, brevity implies that I'm speaking to somebody who can't handle all of the complexity, and therefore I have to summarize and simplify. So which one is it? The answer is, it depends what you're talking about. If it's a teacher to student, that's one reality. If it's within the reality of the teacher's intellect, that's a different story. So it depends what we're speaking about. If I'm talking about two different worlds that are looking to connect, like the world of the teacher and the world of the student, so I've got two completely different intellectual realms, where the one person is way more advanced than the other. Like, for example, the distinction between Tanoim teaching the Mishnah and Amoraim teaching the Gemara, or Gemara un Rishonim, Rishonim on Achronim, all the various other generations of the evolution of Torah. So when I'm comparing one reality to the next, the higher, more advanced reality is always going to be able to contain more information in seed form, in its more compact version. Valdor is the essence for a begillah, and the reason for that is because you're able to see the essence of what the idea is all about, so you don't have to get caught up in all the details. You can immediately see the truth of what the idea is. But as you evolve lower, and the seichel is now speaking a language of people with greater limitations, well, then you have to explain more and explain more in order that people should be able to understand what you're actually saying, because they don't have that clarity that you see it in your own head. In dem Vergleich von Shmi und Re'ir, you see a similar process with the distinction between things that you see versus things that you hear. And if you're seeing something, you see the whole thing immediately, instantaneously. But now, for somebody to hear, that same principle is going to take a lot of time. So you could be looking at a scene, speaking on the phone, you see the entire scene instantaneously, but to describe to somebody else on the phone what you're seeing could take 10 minutes. Mashenkins, that's when you're speaking about one reality connecting to a lower, more limited reality. Then brevity illustrates that you are higher, so you can see everything at once, and detail represents that you are lower, and therefore things have to be explained to you. But when I'm speaking inside the person's own intellect, in other words, or in a realm where people are all of the same caliber, then the exact opposite is true. Well then, when I'm dealing with something that is a more developed concept, a more complex, intricate idea, then I need to explore all of those intricacies so that I get the full picture of the whole idea. And asvara pshuta yoser is memasber b'kitzur yoser. Whereas if the idea is a simple idea, then I can express it simply. So if I'm explaining something that is very simple, I need fewer words in order to explain it because it's self-understood. So let's plug that same distinction into the different levels of Teshuvah. Depends what we're speaking about. In the Madrega, in the Welt vom Mishnah, the Gabi Gemara, wenn dies vor Samukas Aris gebracht bekitzer be'erach Gemara. So first, let's look again. In Mishnah, the world of Mishnah is able to see everything at once, so therefore the words are small. In other words, less words. Aber in Welt von Gemara Gufa, bekayetz bezeh this far Samukas barichus yoser, and this far pshutas mer bekitzer. But when I'm learning a Gemara, if the Gemara is tackling a very thorny issue, it's going to have a tremendous amount of information, and if it's dealing with a simple issue, it will have fewer words, less information. We can apply that back to the story over here of the Teshuvahs. We could take all of these different approaches to Teshuvah, put them into two categories. When I'm speaking about the Teshuvah of Sur Meirah and the Teshuvah of Asei Tov, they both fit into what is called the lower entry-level version of Teshuvah, whereas the Drita Darga, the third level of Bakei Shalom, through Torah, that is Teshuvah Ilah, that's a much more advanced version of Teshuvah. You can see this very simply because the Teshuvah Sur Meirah Asei Tov sanim beida in olam ha'maisa asiya u'shlilas asiya. You could see what is Sur Meirah. It's avoiding a behavior that you shouldn't do. What is Asei Tov? It's doing a behavior that you should do. That's the world of Maisa, the world of action. Whereas the Drita Teshuvah Bakei Shalom is limudat Torah in olam ha'mochim. Whereas the third form of Teshuvah we've said is through Torah learning. Torah learning is not something you do. Torah learning is an intellectual process. That's a whole different world from the world of action. On the Rebbe. So therefore, if I'm comparing those two worlds, then I'll say the Teshuvah was shaykh to moichin is bekitzer yoser. The Teshuvah that is Bakei Shalom, which is through Torah, which is through a much higher element of the human experience through the intellect, must be the quickest Teshuvah. Berega chada, you can do it instantaneously. But because when you're in that world of clarity, that world of Torah learning, because things are more obvious, because things are more clear, the processes are much quicker. So you don't have to schlep your way through unpacking all of the details of what it is that you're trying to do Teshuvah for. It's clear. This is the emes. That's what I need to be associated with. But when I'm comparing the two types of Teshuvah that both belong to the world of Maaseh, well then I'm looking from a different perspective. The Teshuvah from Asei Tov is a hechre darga. In the world of Teshuvah Tata, the more advanced version of Teshuvah is Asei Tov. Therefore, it takes more time. Like when you're trying to understand a deeper svara, it takes more time. Whereas the more simple version of doing Teshuvah by avoidance only takes a short while. In the same way as when you're learning something in Gemara and it happens to be a simpler idea, then it's explained quickly. And by the way, you can see this in practice. If I want to do something which is proactive and appropriate, it's going to take me more time to do it. Whereas if I'm going to avoid something bad, well, that's immediate. As soon as I choose not to do it, that's it. I've achieved Sur Meirah. And the same thing reflects back into the spheres. If I'm talking about Bina is a reality which lives in the world of intellect, which is way beyond the world. Our world is created out of action. So that is a sphere that is called Rega. It's called a quick reality. Because that's a reality where the Eibishter is extremely revealed, and therefore things happen really, really quickly in terms of a relationship and connection with the Eibishter. Whereas Zohar and Malchus, those are lower realities that are already bound by more constrained structures, like the structure of Midas, like the structure of creating a physical world. They are longer periods of time. Yes, of course, Yoma, a day, is longer than Shaita, an hour, but both of them are considerably longer than a Rega, which is just a minute, because this is a reality where things have to be spelled out more. In these spheres, Gufa Ilam Amidas is a Hecha from Malchus, and then in that rubric of the lower worlds, Zoh is the higher compared to Malchus. Then Zoh is called Yoma because that is obviously the so-called higher, more elaborate, complex perspective on life compared to Malchus, and therefore it has more time. requires more time. Now, the truth of the matter is there's a fourth dimension as well, which the Alter Rebbe touches on in Likutei Torah, and we're going to speak about briefly here as well. Like in Bira Anal von Taten, as the drei Leshenis in Zoy Zanim Ramaz, if the drei Daigas Anal Shebetshuva, now that the Rebbe's father has illustrated to us, the Zohar's three codes for describing Tshuva are associated with three levels of Tshuva. We can now look from the perspective of the Ramak, who adds a fourth. As in the Maimer Azayah Zayin Fran Fir Leshenis, he says that the Zohar actually included a fourth expression of Tshuva, or a level of Tshuva. Leshenis Dargas. B'shaita chada, which we've already seen, b'yoma chada. Then he says b'zimna chada, in a single time, and b'riga chada, in a moment. So in Likutei Torah dot is mevur. The Alter Rebbe in Likutei Torah explains what this means. As agam b'chlol zayne dot drei dargas in tshuva, that even though generally speaking we say there are three levels of tshuva, sur meira, asay tov, bakis shalom. The truth is abba b'protius farnoch afer tehecher darga. Bakis Shalom itself is actually split into two levels, and therefore there's a fourth dimension, a much higher dimension of Tshuva, versus Magia and Sfiras HaChochma, which can elevate a person even to access the level of Chochma, which is beyond Bina. And how do you get there? That's through sanctifying ourselves in ordinary mundane activities so that they have a sense of holiness as well. Where would you see that fourth level? You'll see it alluded to in the Ramak's version of the Zohar, where there's a fourth possibility, Zimna Chada. Because typically we'd say a rega is the shortest measurable piece of time, which it is, halachically. But still, the Gemara will analyze, so how long is this rega? Because it is a measurable, even though it's the smallest unit of time, it's a measurable unit. Whichever way you look at the various suggestions of what it is compared to other frames of time, or if it's the amount of time that it takes to say the word rega, which is 3 letters, etc. But the fact is we want to measure it. Mashenken zimna chada, whereas the expression one time is it magdekensham shirzman. That is not a unit of time, it's just the concept of time. In other words, it just simply alludes to the fact that there is time that has elapsed without any way of knowing how much time it is, because it's so tiny we don't have the measures to be able to contain it. So now, if you look at what the Alter Rebbe then continues there, most places that we read only discuss the three levels of Teshuvah. Because generally speaking, we don't split apart Chochmah and Bina, because they are absolutely unified at all times. And there's no Bina b'lei Chochmah. And therefore, for all intents and purposes, that fourth very, very intense level of Teshuvah is incorporated in the third level, which we're calling Bakis Shalom. So that would explain why the most conventional version of the Zohar only includes 3 levels, not the fourth that the Ramak identifies. Because generally speaking, we focus on 3 levels of Teshuvah. But because there is also room in certain analyses where we have to include the fourth level of Teshuvah, so there has to be at least somebody who mentions it. Therefore, there is the opinion of the Ramak, which does include the possibility of this fourth level of Teshuvah, so that we have a full view of all the variations of how Teshuvah operates. And we can appreciate that there's even Teshuvah that gets us to the level of Chochmah, and that's through Kaddish Atzmach and Mutalach. But of course, what's most important for us is to focus on doing Teshuvah. First Sumerah, then Asay Tov, then Bakis Shalom, and eventually at the level of Chochmah, and Emetz Hashem through doing Teshuvah, La'alter L'Teshuvah, La'alter L'Gula, to bring Mashiach now.